Hi there. First thing, if you clicked on this video thinking it would be like a nostalgic sizzle reel with a vibey voiceover, this video isn't that. But stick around until the end, because just for you, I do have a little nostalgic sizzle reel at the end of this video. And the video does have vibey voiceover, just about design instead of nostalgia. What does DS stand for? Not as like an institution or nostalgia vehicle, but as an acronym. What is DS an abbreviation of? To the average person, it's obvious. Dual screen. The console has two screens, and Nintendo wanted to distance its marketing from the highly gendered Game Boy name. Though, we call the coolest girls tomboys, so I don't see why the Game Boy couldn't be a girl too. If you're a weird nerd like me, I'm sure you've heard the alternate abbreviation, Developer's System, which is supposedly what the design team nicknamed it because it was just so dev-friendly to work on. I think it's both, and I think that it's only because of the DS's unique physical design that it could be that system for developers. The DS, to me, is really the peak of Nintendo's design philosophy, the culmination of decades of experience in the handheld and toy design that resulted in one of the most important and successful systems of all time. Gunpei Yokoi was a factory worker, but in his free time, he was a designer. Not a game designer, video games didn't exist yet, but a toy designer. He made gadgets and doodads and playthings. The myth goes that Yokoi was fiddling with a prototype of a toy while taking a break at work, and a Nintendo executive saw it and offered him a design job right there. The resulting toy was the Ultra Hand, the first of many Yokoi designed toys that would influence Nintendo's later work. Later on, Gunpei Yokoi got into Nintendo games, making the first Game & Watch line of LCD games. Single-game arcadey handhelds to go alongside Nintendo's Color TV game line of single-game arcadey home consoles. And then later, Yokoi would work on video games with his R&D1 team at Nintendo, making games like Metroid for the NES. Yokoi's most notable contribution to Nintendo's video games was by far the Game Boy, a portable game console with interchangeable cartridges that... Well, it was the fucking Game Boy! Everybody knows what the Game Boy was. It was a fucking hit! Everybody loved it! It was perfect! Yokoi would later leave Nintendo, and then he died suddenly and tragically in a car crash. His final products were flops or middling successes, but still held on to a little bit of his unbeatable design philosophy that pushed himself and Nintendo so far. But what was that philosophy? I think it was of a few parts. He designed games like they were toys, which meant he prioritized conveyance, accessibility, and affordability. The Game & Watch units were basically made with calculator parts and contained simple games. They were cheap, accessible, and user-facing in their design. They featured controls tailored to the games contained on the unit, and were so simple that someone who'd never used one before could figure it out and start playing with it. Metroid was an exploration-based game, like Zelda, but instead of using RPG and RPG-alike arcade tropes, it used platformer tropes. It played like if Mario Bros. Was an adventure game. Instead of keys, doors, and cryptic puzzles, it had power-ups, obstacles, and enemy gauntlets. It took the structure of a difficult-to-understand and obtuse game and used the tropes of a simple and easy-to-understand game as a mechanism to make the game more accessible and conveyant than other games were at the time. The Game Boy famously had a worse screen, lesser controls, and simpler games compared to its competition. The Game Gear and Lynx were massive and exorbitant handhelds that, in the case of the Game Gear, literally brought home consoles into players' pockets, if they were wearing cargo pants. But the Game Boy won, not just because the console was cheap and used fewer batteries than the competition, though that certainly helped, but also because that simple and limited design made it more appealing to customers. I'm going to take a tangent real quick, away from Nintendo and over to Atari, to illustrate my point. In the mid-70s, some nerds started a company called Syzygy Engineering that would make electronic arcade games to bring experiences from highly expensive computers into the same room as typical pinball cabinets. Their first game was very direct to this point. It was called Computer Space. It was an almost one-to-one clone of an earlier computer game called Space War. It involved two ships circling a black hole and shooting at each other. It bombed. Almost no arcade operators bought the thing, and those that did probably never saw it make back the money they'd spent. Syzygy renamed itself to Atari and made a second game called Pong. It was an overnight success. Before the video game craze, or even the arcade craze, there was just the Pong craze. Every bar, family restaurant, and pinball parlor got a machine. And if they didn't get Pong, they had a clone of it. But Space War was a more advanced game than Pong. It had vector graphics and complicated physics and spaceships. Star Wars was massive just a few years after Pong, and the space race was still in its waning days in 1971. So why did Computer Space fail where Pong succeeded? Because Computer Space was opaque, and Pong was transparent. Computer Space had complicated physics, and shooting, and a black hole, and spaceships, and required at least a couple minutes of learning curve even to understand, let alone get any good at. But Pong was simple. You had a little rotary encoder that moved a rectangle, and there was a single ball. Pong used familiar context and direct control to make video games easy for someone to understand and enjoy. Not just as easy as something like pinball or a board game, but easier. Something as simple as playing actual ping pong. Just like Pong, the Game Boy won for a reason. It had simple controls, something that most gamers were familiar with, and that a casual could quickly figure out. It played simple games. Early on, it had to play simple games, because without expensive mapper cartridges, it couldn't support anything else. And its games all had to be highly conveyant, more so than even home console games of the time, because if they weren't, you would barely be able to tell what was going on the Game Boy's awful penny-pinched screen. So, that's the history lesson. Gunpei Yokoi and other designers make successful games and game consoles by focusing on accessibility and conveyance. But you might have just been itching through that entire segment because this is a video about the DS! You're not here for nerd shit and boomer memories of Pong. You're here to indulge your Y2K nostalgia dressed up in an easy listening video essay. And I'm here to make Y2K nostalgia dressed up in an easy listening video essay. Which is why we're now moving to the DS and focusing entirely on it and its direct history. So let's set the scene. The GBA was a successful console, but was already starting to feel outdated, and the GameCube was being eaten alive by some fancy DVD players called Xbox and PlayStation 2. Nintendo's experimental new games were being spit on by critics and fans alike. What Nintendo needed was a way to sell systems to people who already had a PlayStation or didn't even want one in the first place. They needed something to make gaming accessible and simple again. They couldn't rely on the Game Boy's formula, not with Sony's powerful new handheld on the horizon. They needed something new, a nitro boost to bring their handhelds into the next generation while a home console revolution waited in the wings. Nintendo's handheld business had been reliable from the 70s forward, through even the floundering Nintendo 64 and GameCube years. But the Game Boy needed to step down. And so, the DS. The DS didn't just succeed because of Mario, or because Nintendo was better at handheld games than Sony. The DS succeeded because of what it was. Because it was the most accessible, convenient, and versatile game console ever made, even beating its younger sibling, the Wii, in both sales and in innovation. The explosion of App Store games on the iPhone just a few years later wouldn't have happened how it did if the industry hadn't had the DS there to get its hands dirty with casual games in your pocket. But what exactly is good about the design of the DS? First, the obvious stuff about the physical design of the hardware. It's a small clamshell unit about the size of a modern smartphone. That clamshell feature goes all the way back to the Game & Watch line, which featured some two-screened clamshell games that utilized the two screens to display vertical games that would have been difficult to put on a handheld otherwise. Clamshells are obviously good design, and there's a reason Nintendo handhelds were doing it since the early 80s. The size of the unit might seem surface level and unimportant at first, but I think in the modern age of Goliath handhelds, it's an important distinction. Even the original Model DS folded up to be the size of a Game Boy Color, and in play, the console isn't all that much bigger. The whole unit isn't larger in any one dimension than just the screen of the Switch Lite, including bezels. The DS is a small handheld, and that makes it both convenient to have with you, especially in a world before massive smartphones, and comfortable for long sessions, especially in the hands of a child. The next important thing about the physical design of the DS is the input and output. The DS has two screens on its two halves. The top half of the unit is focused entirely on output. It has a non-touch screen and a pair of speakers. The lower half of the unit has a shared purpose of input and output, with a bias towards input. Here, you can find all of your buttons for play, as well as your power button, volume slider, the stylus, game cartridge ports, and touchscreen. Needless to say, this part of the DS could be an entire console on its own. The bottom half also does something that is weird in a modern context, but wasn't quite as unusual back then. It has both a full set of physical buttons and a very strong focus on its touchscreen. This is very different from something like a modern smartphone, which forgoes every button other than power and volume to focus entirely on meaningful user input through touch, while also being different from modern handhelds from touch, because the touchscreen is actually a central focus of the device, and not a semi-obscure feature like on the Nintendo Switch or Steam Deck. This dual input setup is a major strength of the DS. Touchscreen control is obviously the most accessible and transparent kind of input for a casual user. It is simple, direct, and allows for immediate feedback. But traditional button control is what makes the DS able to cross the casual and pro divide as a game console. Because despite it heavily focusing on touch, the DS is still very capable of traditional game input. The combination of what is essentially the SNES layout, and by consequence, the same controller that traditional games were using from 1990 to the present day, with a highly focal touchscreen, meant that the games on the console were both more accessible to casuals and willing to have depth and traditional control schemes without compromise. Because of this dual control method of the DS, it was accessible both to capital G gamers and the average person. As a side note on the touchscreen, I think it's an important part of the DS's design that the touchscreen is resistive instead of capacitive. Steve Jobs is famously quoted as saying, "Fuck styluses! I hate them, I hate them, I hate them!" This is because he was an idiot. Capacitive touch is the kind of touch detection that modern smartphones use, which detects things like human skin, and resistive touch is the kind of touch used in stylus-based devices, which detects pressure from any hard, concentrated point, like, say, a stylus. A finger touch-based device might seem better for accessibility, but stylus touch is much more similar to other touch-based input that people, especially children, use day to day, like writing and drawing. As well, a stylus allows for more precise touch than your finger, which is important on a small screen you use for games. The second result of the varied input on the DS is that it allowed for Nintendo to do something that they love to do. Since the Nintendo 64, originally called the Ultra 64 as a nod to the Ultra Hand, Nintendo has always liked making multimodal input devices that you can use in lots of ways. The N64 was designed for tons of use cases. Just see the various input methods for GoldenEye if you want an example. The Wii and DS are really the culmination of this design, though they've kept up with it all the way to the Switch 2's new Joy-Con controllers. In the DS's case, the console can be held either in one hand or two, either horizontally or vertically, and either right-handed or left-handed, depending on what game you're playing. This multimodal design was seen as a downside on the N64 controller, but I think in the DS's case it shows its merit very obviously, with tons of games like Metroid Prime Hunters, Rhythm Heaven, and Super Mario 64 DS making use of the different kinds of input available. The console's physical design was set up from the very start to focus on making lots of kinds of games, and making accessible games for all sorts of players. Child, adult, elderly, casual, and hardcore alike could enjoy the DS. But a console isn't just a shaped object. It's a computer with hardware capabilities. And just like on the Game Boy, those capabilities shaped the games that were on the console. The DS is generally similar in capability to the Nintendo 64, at least for one of the two screens, and the behind-the-scenes game code processing. But the other screen of the console also has to display something. And those graphics are literally a GBA. They took a GBA, gave it a bigger screen, and stapled it into their new hardware. Every DS, even DSi's, have built-in GBA hardware and use it in every game. What that means is that the DS is capable of 3D, but that 3D is going to have to be heavily stylized to look good. And it's going to be way better at playing 2D games with heavy 3D effects than actual 3D-only games. This hardware approach meant that the kinds of games DS developers ended up focusing on were 2D games almost entirely, with a lot fewer 3D games, by comparison, than Sony's contemporary handheld, the PSP. This resulted in the DS beating the PSP until it was a bloody corpse on the ground. The same way that Sony's 2D and light 3D focused PlayStation beat the 3D focused N64 by using flashy effects, pre-rendered FMV environments, and large textures. The DS built the PSP's 3D games and movie playing with stylized graphics, casual focused touch games, and a low price. The physical body and software capabilities of the DS basically tailored it to be exactly what the average person wanted out of a handheld in the 2000s. And that led to it succeeding far beyond its contemporaries. It wasn't Nintendo IP, or tech enthusiasm, or any external factor that made the DS and its games so special. It was the console itself, the design and engineering behind its form and functions that led to the console succeeding how it did. And boy, how did it succeed.
Nine a winner, pay the front line, take the don'ts. He's coming out again for a new point. Get your bets down, ladies and gentlemen. 4-4's the point, mark 4. Ace, deuce, scrap, want 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 4. Ace, deuce, ace, deuce, scrap, want 4. Scrap, want 4. Who wants the hard 4? 5 wants 4.
Check me out, y'all.
9 a winner, got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 9 a winner, got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 4, and he made it the hard way. Hey, the front line takes the hard. We have a shooter and a good one. Coming out for a new point. Get your bets down, ladies and gentlemen. He's a rolling point is 9. Place 9. Place 9. 8 shooting for 9. 5 shooting for 9. He's a rolling point is 9. Place 9. 8 shooting for 9. 5 shooting for 9. Who wants to come? 6 to point.
Check me out, y'all.
9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets. Place your bets. Who wants to come? 6 to point. Who wants to come? 6 to point. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen.
So funky. So funky. Check me out, y'all.
8 shooting for 9. 5 shooting for 9. He's a rolling point is 9. Place 9. 8 shooting for 9. 5 shooting for 9. Who wants to come? Place 6.
So funky. So funky.
Coming out again for a new point.
So funky.
Bets down, ladies and gentlemen. Who wants the hard 4?
So funky.
5 wants 4.
Check me out, y'all.
4 4's the point, mark 4.
So funky.
Ace, deuce, scrap, want 4. Ace, deuce, deuce.
So funky.
Scrap, want 1. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Got a hot hand. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Got a hot hand. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Who wants to come?
Check me out, y'all.
9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 9 a winner. Got a hot hand. Place your bets. Place your bets. 9 a winner. Pay the front line. Take the don'ts. He's coming out again for a new point. Get your bets down, ladies and gentlemen. 4 4's the point. Mark 4. Ace, deuce, ace, deuce. Who wants to come? 6 to point. Who wants to come? 6 to point. Who wants to come? 6 to point. Play 6.